Friends, very good to have you join us. James, very nice to see you.
Nice to see you in. Very good to see you indeed. Yes.
And are you well?
I'm very well, actually. Yes. I went out for a nice walk this afternoon with my
Excellent.
daughter, which was great. Yeah.
Good,
Nice sunshine. Yeah.
good. Yeah, it's nice to.
East Anglia has been very, very wet overnight.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Flood warnings everywhere. So the sun coming out was a great sign of hope. Yeah.
Good. Well, that might relate to our passage today. We never know.
Right.
Speaking of our passage, where are we in the lectionary, James?
Yeah. We're on Mark chapter 8 and verses 31 to 38. It's a little passage sandwiched in between Peter's confession of Jesus as Messiah and the Transfiguration, which we looked at last week or a couple of weeks ago.
We did.
And we're on the second Sunday of Lent. Yeah, Lent
Yeah,
2.
we are already. And before we plunge into passage, there's a few things we just want to encourage people to do, isn't there?
Yeah, we would be delighted if you liked the videos, click like. We'd be delighted if you subscribe to the channel if you're just coming and finding us first time. We'd love you to share on the social media.
Social media, indeed. Yeah.
That
You can
would
just
be great.
click on the thing, it copies the link, and you can paste it wherever you want.
Paste it in, and then do join in with the chat. I mean, we have chat on YouTube, we have chat on the social media.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear your comments, love to get your insights into the passage.
Mm.
That's always very enriching. So thank you. Yeah.
Good. Now, this passage is fascinating. We again repeatedly say Mark is quite a compressed gospel, even though some of his narratives are extended. And this is again a shortest passage. What is it? 7 verses, but packs an awful lot of stuff in.
It certainly does. I mean, it's really a passage that packs in a lot about messiahship and a lot about discipleship, which is really interesting given the context. Yeah.
And I think it's quite important. You mentioned from the outset the fact that this is sitting between two very contrasting passages. So in the sense that you've got the high point, really, the turning point of the gospel, Peter's confession of who Jesus is at Caesarea Philippi, just before this. Then, as you mentioned, we explored the Transfiguration, which is another extraordinary kind of high point as well, in terms of, a revelation of who Jesus really is.
Yes.
And yet then this passage fits in between those, and it creates this very strong sense of tension within the whole narrative of the gospel, doesn't it?
Definitely. You've got I mean, this is the first time I think Jesus begins to talk about his suffering so explicitly, and we'll see, we'll no doubt come on to that. But up till this point, we've had Jesus acting in power, essentially. There's been an extraordinary, just before the incident with Peter, there's been an extraordinary healing of the blind man, and there's been powerful teaching and so on. And there's been the miraculous feedings and so on. So there's been a strong sense of the power of Jesus, and here we get the kind of the other side of that, which is the necessary suffering, and so there is definitely a tension here, and this is a tension now which we've had sort of precursors of in the first half of the gospel, but now this tension ramps up, doesn't it, to the cross?
Yeah, and in fact, it was interesting, wasn't it? Last week, I mean, you made a particular point about the connection between Mark 1, that passage you're looking at, and Mark 9, the Transfiguration. But in fact, Mark 1, we also noted this tension already in the voice from heaven, for example, which was talking both in affirmative ways, but also highlighting the fact this is an eschatological moment, and that this will also involve suffering. The language of my beloved son, had echoes of Abraham and his son, take your son, your beloved son, and also then the Messiah figure, the suffering servant as well in Isaiah.
Yes, indeed, absolutely.
And there's just on the question of context, one of the other things that strikes me here as well is that, I mean, you mentioned that we've got some learning to do about what it means to be Messiah, and we've got learning to do about what it means to be disciples. And in fact, I love the way that Mark's gospel in particular emphasizes the need to learn, because actually in Mark we've had not just one feeding of the 5,000 but also the feeding of the 4,000. We've had not just one set of teaching following that, but 2 sets of teaching following that. And then one of my favorite episodes is where Jesus heals a blind man, but he doesn't do it instantly. He says, no. What do you see? And the man says, I see men like trees walking. So his sight is only partially restored, and it requires a second touch from Jesus. And it seems to me the reason why Mark puts that in, includes that story, is because the disciples need more than one touch from Jesus in order to understand what on earth's going on.
Absolutely, it takes multiple times, and it's interesting that after the blind man has been the second time, that when he's completely healed, he very tellingly, I think, says, "I can see." He saw everything clearly, is how Mark describes it.
Yeah.
And of course, what we've got now is
Mm.
Jesus telling everybody plainly, is the word parousia, and so I think there's a real connection there.
Yeah.
But also this emphasis on disciples need to learn, and they don't learn in sort of one episode.
Yes.
It's very interesting that this prediction of the passion of the suffering of Jesus is the first of three,
Yeah.
and the other two come in the next two chapters.
Yeah.
And each time the context is he says the same words, basically very, very similar words to the disciples. So they obviously didn't get it the first time, they didn't fully get it the second time.
No.
And so he's having to keep on teaching
Yeah.
this message, because presumably their notions of messiahship, which of course is what Peter expresses when he says you are the Messiah, are so embedded, so strong,
Mm.
and particularly that they don't involve suffering,
Yeah.
that Jesus needs to really completely transform and re-inhabit what their expectations are.
And I can't help feeling that this sense that he needs to embark on this teaching is captured in the opening words of our passage here in verse 31, where it says, well, first of all, we've had this revelation of who he is. And of course, in Matthew, in the parallel there, Jesus says, well, this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And then Jesus says at the end of that little section, the last thing he said in verse 30, Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him, because
Yes,
which suggests that sense of misunderstanding of who he is as
yes,
Messiah. And then he began to teach them that. So he's
yeah,
embarking on this strategy of reforming their understanding of what it means
yeah.
for him to be the Messiah, to be the anointed one. And it's very telling as well, isn't it, that the register of his language changes. So although I think we've had the term Son of Man
We
before,
have. It's in chapter 2, but we haven't had it since chapter 2.
because the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah,
That's right.
but there's been an absolute silence on that. So it comes back now, and it comes back multiple times now through the gospel.
Yeah.
So
So
it's a title that he uses in the early part of his ministry, but not since.
Absolutely, yeah. So,
Yeah,
and I think I did a count up that the phrase comes 13 times in the gospel, and 11
yeah.
are from here on, the second half. So it's very much marks the tone and the feel of the second half of the gospel, isn't it?
It is indeed. And it's interesting that phrase at the beginning of verse 31, then he began to teach, it almost implies that this process of teaching is going to have to continue. This is not the sum total of what he's going to have to say. He's going to have to say this again.
Yeah,
And he presumably is also filling it out further with the disciples as they carry on the way to Jerusalem.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So this is, well, I think there's an interesting tension there, isn't it? And we talk about the roadway. So there's a sense in which we've seen that discipleship can often have a very radical and decisive beginning. So they leave their nets and they follow him on the one hand.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you've got this dynamic of discipleship that it's a journey, it's a process of learning and continuing to learn. So it
Yeah.
is both decisive and it's continuous.
Absolutely. And obviously the if you're going to reimagine, as it were, messiahship for the disciples, to correct their understanding of what it's truly going to mean, then if they are disciples, their whole job is to imitate the master. So
Yeah.
you've got to reimagine discipleship alongside it. So there's a complete logic to this passage, which I think is really very, very clear.
Mm.
Yeah.
Just it's worth pausing for a second there in relation to the passage and just saying, well, how do we understand this term Son of Man? I felt
Yeah.
there's been three sort of reference points in the Old Testament, which I think are relatively well known. But
Yeah.
for me, it's helped to fill out what Jesus is talking about at the time, because actually the three examples I'm going to mention from the Old Testament do correspond to the three ways that we see this term used in the gospel.
Yeah.
Now, the first one is a very well known Psalm 8, where the psalmist says, "What is now?" Careful use of words here. Let me just quote from the ESV, which is matches some of the language of the Authorized Version as well. "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? But yet you've made him lower than the angels," and all that kind of thing. But it's a focus on the creatureliness, the fragility, the the finitude of
Yeah.
humanity. And in that sense, this language, now we've got a bit of a problem because obviously modern translations don't want to use unnecessarily sexed language. And in fact,
No, no.
it should be, what are human beings, that you're mindful
Yeah.
of. But that idiom in Hebrew, Ben Adam, the son of man, it's difficult to translate that because you want to say sort of, I think one version says, TNIV says, mere mortals or fragile human beings.
Yes,
So,
yes.
but actually, of course, if you don't translate the actual phrase "son of man," you miss the parallel with the New Testament.
You do, and I think the new one of the other references, which of course is in Ezekiel
Yeah,
to this phrase, is I think the new RSV. I think it always translates it mortal. So once again, you miss the fact that
yeah,
actually this phrase is occurring at different points through the scriptural narrative,
mm,
and it seems to be the case that it's a slightly enigmatic
mm,
title, and it can mean different things in different contexts. But Jesus seems to use it to bring together a number of different
yeah,
ideas from
yeah,
these different contexts, doesn't he?
yeah.
So, I mean, once again, you not only Ezekiel, but you also have classically the Daniel 7
Yeah.
passage as well, where you get this the exaltation of someone who has suffered,
Yeah.
and you also get, I think, an eschatological dimension as well. So
Now, James, you're galloping there ahead of me. So
yeah, okay, well,
you're anticipating what I was going to mention.
oh, was I? I'm sorry.
Yeah, but it's just that it's worth noting that in Psalm 8,
Yeah,
this is about the fragility of being a creature.
indeed. Yeah,
It
yeah,
seems to me in Ezekiel the register has shifted a bit because, of course,
yes,
the mere mortal, the Son of Man, that God addressed him, is in a contrast to the sovereignty and majesty of God.
yes,
So it emphasizes that fragility.
yeah,
And of course, there's a paradox because on the one hand, here we have right at the very beginning of Mark's gospel, the way of God is being prepared, and then when that way is prepared, who actually do you see coming? The answer is Jesus. So Jesus is bringing the presence of God to his people on the one hand.
yeah,
On the other hand, if using the Son of Man language with the Ezekiel background, his humanity and his fragility is a contrast to majesty, and that
yeah,
actually holds on to, I think, this amazing paradox between this suffering and then the vision they're going to have in the transfiguration. And then, as you
yeah,
said, the third one is the example from Daniel chapter 7. And I did have, when we talked about this before, it's interesting. I just looked
mm,
back at the comments on my blog, and one or two people said, "Hey, that's a bit of a fragile link, isn't it?" Because the phrase just occurs once there in Daniel 7:13. But in fact, in the Gospels, Jesus uses more language from Daniel 7, which
yeah,
actually makes the connection clear. He talks about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, which is
yeah,
and uses exactly that Danielic phrase. Although, of course, we need to remember in Daniel, we've talked about this before, the coming is the coming to the throne of the Ancient of Days, not the coming
indeed,
from the throne
indeed,
down to the earth. So we need to remember.
indeed. Yeah, and I think we have to keep remembering that Jesus draws on Isaiah and Daniel particularly
Yeah,
for his self-understanding in the Gospels, and
yeah,
and that is there in the many allusions to those
mm,
texts that we find, and we need to keep remembering that it's not
mm,
just one-offs; it's there right through.
yeah. And just to go back to Mark's gospel, again, what's interesting is that those three dimensions are sort of merely human, the fragile
Mm,
in contrast to God, and then the one who's exalted. They all of these actually do form part of Jesus's use of the term in Mark's gospel. So, for example, I mean, you
yeah.
mentioned that in Mark 2, Jesus talks about, the Sabbath was made for people, for man,
Yes.
for humanity. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord. Again, it only makes sense if you do
Yeah.
use the man language. So
Yeah.
there you have Jesus as the sort of archetypal human, which correlates to, Psalm 8.
Yeah.
But then you get particularly these texts about the Son of Man suffering, which tie into both the Ezekiel and the Danielic use of the phrase. So we do get
Yeah.
quite a strong match between these themes in the Old Testament language and how Jesus uses the term in the gospel.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So he began to teach them the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected. Just something I think is quite interesting here is that in this of the first three predictions of his suffering in Mark, he has the most expansive description of the opponents. So he's rejected by the
Yes.
elders and the chief priest and the teachers of the law. I don't know why that's significant for the first time, because in the next two, in Mark 9:31 and then in Mark
Yeah.
10:33, the opposition is slightly more compressed and the emphasis
It,
shifts
it
somewhere else.
is. It is. I mean, I think the statement here is, in a sense, it's emphasizing the. Well, interesting. One of the commentators says that he's making the point that Jesus is executed at the hands of the most respected lawyers, the Sanhedrin, and then also, of course, the Romans in the ancient world. I mean, these were, and this is not just one or two. This was a whole bunch of lawyers. You know, this was many more than the Supreme Court of England. You know, so you know, it's a significant, no, 70 odd or something, isn't it, in the Sanhedrin? So
Yes.
there may be something there, but it's a political, juridical act that Jesus dies.
Yeah. And he's emphasizing the sort of serried ranks of opposition that he's going to
Yes, yes, absolutely. They're like kind of, yeah, you could see them in, absolutely. They're laid out. So, yeah.
And this also then leads in from a narrative point of view, because again, this second half of the gospel is marked very sharply by conflict and opposition as the narrative unfolds.
Yeah, yeah.
And then
yeah.
yes, go on.
And then we get verse 32. We get,
well,
you know,
exactly
which is probably what you're going to say. But I mean, it's
It is.
interesting, isn't it, that he said all this quite openly, quite plainly. This is and now this is really interesting, because this word plainly, parasia, is a word which John uses a lot.
Yes, he does.
But it's only used here in the Synoptics, and it's used quite in contrast to the way John uses it, where I normally say, "Tell us plainly something." You know, that's what the people are demanding Jesus to speak plainly rather than figures of speech. But here he uses it particularly of Jesus' suffering. So this that's I just think that's quite a particular take on it. And this openness and this secretness in Mark's gospel is a theme that runs through, isn't it?
It is. And there's in this verse, there's a funny little dynamic of back and forwards about openness and so, because immediately, again, this narrative is incredibly compressed.
It is, yeah.
And Jesus speaks openly about this. Now I think he's talking to the disciples still.
He is, yeah.
He began to teach them, the disciples, yeah. So he's saying this plainly to the disciples. And then the implication, Peter takes him aside. So Peter's having a one-to-one with him and saying, you know, don't this, surely not. But again, in a very compressed way. And then Jesus turns and looks at the disciples. So although Peter's taken him aside and as a one-to-one, saying, "Come on, Jesus, you know, you got this wrong." Kind of Matthew 18 thing, isn't it? That just talk to the person on their own.
That's right.
And then he turns to the disciple. So he refuses the private rebuke from Peter and rebukes him in front of the disciples.
Yeah.
And then in verse 34, it gets even more public. So then it says he called the crowd to him. And of course, there's always dynamic between the disciples or the insiders who know, and the crowd who have to listen out to the parables and work it out. And are they going to be drawn in? Are they going to ask those questions? And suddenly that difference is collapsed. And Jesus is teaching quite clearly about both who he is and what discipleship means.
Yes, indeed. And I think it's interesting that Peter's language is very strong. I think there's a parallelism here. Jesus began to teach in verse 31, and here Peter begins to rebuke. But the word for rebuke is interesting. It's a very strong word. It's the word that is used to exorcise a demon. So it's a powerful, So that shows kind of just how wrong Peter's got. He thinks that all of this is a satanic thing, in a sense. It's not of God. You know, there's suffering and death and all the rest of it. And Jesus rebukes him and says, "No, this actually is the way of God. And I'm going to rebuke you now." So it's a very, it's quite, and it's an intense exchange, isn't it? It's
really
not.
Is.
I don't think I think everybody, all the disciples, would have been quite embarrassed and
shocked
and shocked and everything. I think there's a kind of awkwardness that goes that is here. So
it's interesting you've mentioned parallels with the fourth gospel as well, because again, there's some connection here. There's a sense in which in the synoptics, Jesus is kind of with the disciples. In the fourth gospel, Jesus is very much enigmatic. He's on his own. He's detached from the disciples. And there's a sense in which here we get a bit of a Johannine moment where Jesus alone understands what this whole business is about. And even though he's begun to teach the disciples, even though that blind man's had a second touch from Jesus and that sort of Peter here, we're halfway through the gospel, and Peter really has completely failed to understand. And you know, you'd have thought his closest associate here still has no idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And the language which Jesus uses, he says, "Get behind me, Satan." Actually, it's the same language that Jesus uses to Satan in Matthew chapter 4 in the temptation of the wilderness. Get out. Satan is basically what he says.
Yeah.
So it's very strong, very, very strong language.
It is.
And we
It is.
we
It's I do think we sometimes, I mean, I think in popular language we slightly misunderstand this because "get behind me,
yeah.
Satan" sounds like just going out of the way. In fact, I think here there's some language of discipleship. He doesn't actually describe Peter as the Satan,
No, he doesn't. No, no.
which is quite important to note.
Yeah.
And getting behind me means basically fall into line.
Fall
So
into line as a disciple. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
you
Yeah,
do not have in
absolutely.
mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
Wow. Yeah.
So then we get to verse 34.
So we've kind of dealt with messiahship, and now we get the
The discipleship.
outworking of that renewed messiahship in
Yeah.
discipleship,
Yeah.
don't we? And we get this lang. Well, we have. I think we basically we have this real huge challenge, don't we, about
Yeah.
taking up the cross,
Yeah.
um, which
Now,
I think
interesting
we've
tension here.
misunderstood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like, quite exactly. I mean, this is incredibly well-known language. I mean, I remember when I was a teenager and came to faith, this is one of the sort of early memory verses you learn, Mark 8:34, whoever
Yeah.
wants to come after me must deny themselves, take up the cross and follow me. Um, Again, just sort of interesting to note that whoever wants to be my disciple, that is, if you want to follow me as the one you're going to learn from, you can't actually, as it were, watch from a distance or look in theory. You have to actually walk the path. You have to come after me. You have to walk the path that I'm walking. And of course, this language about taking up your cross has got in popular language as well. It's the cross I've got to bear. When we talk
Yeah.
about,
Yeah. Yeah.
something irritating in life, or the fact your computer doesn't work, or the fact that your a friend criticizes you, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But of
Yeah.
course, again, that's a misunderstanding, isn't it? Because in the first century world, if anybody saw someone carrying their cross, they'd know exactly what that meant.
Yes, they were on their way to die a cruel and horrible death at the hands of Roman authority. There is absolutely nothing that you can do. There is only a terrible death to be endured. That is unbelievably powerful language. The cross is a total claim on a disciple's allegiance, isn't it? And there's no way you can mitigate it. I don't think in those first century terms.
No, there's a little historical question. I've got some scholar friends who are very skeptical about whether this is really a saying of Jesus, because there's no sense in which this sort of language pre-existed. Jesus isn't quoting an aphorism that they're already
No.
in culture. This is something completely unheard of. And so they say, my slightly skeptical friends say, well, this really only makes sense after the crucifixion. So this is a saying of the early church, which they then projected back onto Jesus in the Gospels, which I'm not convinced about.
No, I'm not either. I mean, I think Jesus, unless you decide that Jesus had no idea that he was going to suffer and die, that there was that the outcome of the way he was going about the mission of God was something other than what actually happened. I think it has to be a perfectly reasonable thing, and Jesus is one of the most creative communicators the world has ever seen. So to be able to pluck an image, to use it powerfully in a rhetorical situation, seems entirely in keeping with everything else we know about him in the Gospels.
Yeah. And another really interesting thing is that this phrase about taking up your cross, we don't find it anywhere else in
No,
the teaching of
no.
Paul or in the other thing or in Revelation, whatever. So they use quite different language. So that actually, even if you are wanting to be historically skeptical, that argues against it being a creation of the early church.
Absolutely.
You'd have thought there'd then be, if it was, there'd
It
be
would be everywhere. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, yeah,
I
absolutely.
think the other two other things strike me about this. One is that it's not a very appealing message.
It
I
is
mean,
not.
it's the classic reworking of that is that people quote as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, when Christ bids a man come, he bids him come and die. Sorry if I said that. When Christ calls a man, I think so. He bids him
Yeah.
come and die. And actually, we do see that idea all over the rest of the New Testament. So I love the great example is where Paul on his first missionary journey is traveling through Lystra and Derbe in Acts 14, and Luke kind of summarizes Paul's teaching in Acts 14:22, where he says, through much tribulation we must enter the kingdom of God, through many sufferings we must enter the kingdom of God. Now I just find it fascinating that that's Luke's summary of Paul's evangelistic message. That
Yeah.
it's like, come and hear Paul preach and you'll really discover what suffering's about. So
Yeah.
that is kind of interesting. And it resonates for me a little bit with these. You see these recruitment adverts for things like the Navy where, you have to go through all sorts
Yes.
of terrible things, but
Yeah.
actually you're a better person as a result of it. And the other little connection for me as well is with this, there's this sort of area of happiness research. What does it make people happy? And I just heard last week Michael Mosley saying it is just one thing you need to do to make your life better. Just one thing is do a selfless act for other people. And
Mm.
interesting, he said that there's medical evidence that forgetting about your own needs and focusing on the needs of another person and just doing something like that, making it a habit,
Yeah.
has a better effect on mental health than cognitive behavioral therapy,
Yes.
which is extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. I had a similar conversation with one of my curates this week about how we challenge our young people, and actually that it's very easy in the church to simply say, well, what are the needs of the young people? How can we meet them?
Yeah.
Whereas actually, when I was young, and it sounds a little bit like when you were young, when we were, growing up in the church or
In the old days.
in the old days, that actually what I found really attractive was the challenge of Jesus. I wanted something to live for, something that was different,
Yeah.
something that gave me a certainty, a surety of the
Yeah.
path that I was following, because I
Mm,
felt at sea otherwise.
mm,
So I think we underestimate the attractiveness of the challenge. And I think today, particularly, people look around them, see all sorts of things going on and ways of living which are not worthwhile.
mm,
So the
mm,
challenge of a different way is actually really quite attractive because it's
mm.
coherent and it's powerful.
And we need
So
to be sure that the language of denying yourself, this isn't about kind of self-loathing, but I just looked
no,
at one
not at
of the
all.
lexicons. It was really interesting that the verb here,
Yeah,
apomai, is to refuse to pay attention to what one's own desires are saying, to refuse to think about what one wants for oneself. It is about this turning away from your own concerns and needs and simply self-forgetting and simply focusing on the needs of others, denying yourself and,
yeah,
and having an outward-looking life.
yeah, absolutely. So we have that, and then we have four statements about discipleship that take us through to the
Mhm.
end of the passage, don't we? We have whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses life will, for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, will save it. What will it profit?
Paradoxical exchange.
Paradoxical exchange, a very interesting structure. Yes, a
Mm,
straightforward, very beautifully written chiasm, as we would
mm,
say.
mm, mm.
Yeah, absolutely.
If folks
Interesting
don't know what a chiasm is, just look it up. It's about kind of a structure of language.
structural saying.
Yeah.
It's particularly interesting, though. I think the third part of that chiasm is particularly interesting. Whoever loses their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel.
Gospel. Yeah. Yeah.
That's not just
Mm,
so there's a kind of view to something really quite fundamental there. The gospel is the gospel of the one who suffers and
yeah.
is
Yeah.
vindicated, isn't it? So
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
And then there's the second one. What will it profit if you gain the whole world and lose your life? We can live
Yeah. Some
without.
translations say soul, but it isn't really soul in terms of
No,
it
it's
means the
more
whole of
than
who
that,
you
isn't
are.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I love it. I love the fact that Jesus says you can live without the world, but you can't live without your life. So it's kind of great, isn't it?
Yeah.
What can you give in return?
For your own
What
life.
can you give in return for your life?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
There's a
then
wonderful irony there because Jesus actually goes on to say in Mark 10:45, he gives himself for us.
us,
So
yeah,
we can't give anything in exchange, but actually it's his life
he,
he gives on the cross,
yeah,
which
he
is
can do it.
an exchange for us.
Yeah, he can do it, but we can't do it on ourselves. Once again, the emphasis on what Jesus has done and what Jesus is going to do
Yeah. Yeah.
for us rather than on ourselves. And then, of course, finally, these words about those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation,
Mm.
of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of God. So we now get to the eschatological dimension,
Yes, we do.
don't we?
Yeah.
So important.
Yeah. And it just struck me reading this for the first time. I think I've not noticed this before, but this language of the Son of Man comes in with his Father's glory and his holy angels, which is exactly what you find in that account of the sheep and the goats thing in
Matthew
Matthew
25, yeah.
25. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there you have a
Interesting.
little Matthean nugget there as well.
You do.
Yeah.
You do. That's
Yeah.
and it kind of feels like it's tripping off the tongue of Jesus as though it's a phrase that he might have used a few
Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
Mm.
Indeed.
Mm.
Just fascinating contrast here. Fascinating uh sorry, just something happened there, just distracted me. Just the fascinating tension here again, which is that on the one hand, Jesus is emphatically saying there's nothing you can do. Therefore, what you must do is deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. And I think, again, all the way through the gospel, there's this tension between the fact that there's nothing that we can do. It's Jesus who does it for us. Therefore, in response to what Jesus does for us, this is what we must do.
Yeah.
So that on the one hand, it's not about works that prove something or earn something. But on the other hand, the gift of life that Jesus gives us always demands a response of discipleship.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
James, I think our time is up.
Time is up. I think it is, Ian.
There's
Yeah.
so much there to unpack. Friends,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us. James, thank you for the conversation. And don't forget to do those 4 things, which are to like and to subscribe and to share on the social media. And if there's anything we've missed or brushed over or you want to push back on, then do have a comment and we'll continue the conversation. So, friends, thanks very much. See you again. James, see you again soon.
Thank you.